On paper, my life made sense. In my head, it didn't. And for a long time, I didn't think that mattered. I thought confusion was just something you carried quietly while you kept going. I didn't feel lost. That was the dangerous part. When people talk about being lost, they imagine chaos, mistakes, obvious failure. That wasn't my experience. My life looked organized, stable, predictable. From the outside, there was nothing to fix. I woke up on time. I did what I was supposed to do. I showed up. I answered messages. I met expectations. I made decisions that were reasonable, responsible, and easy to explain. If someone asked me where I was headed, I had an answer. It might not have been exciting, but it sounded correct. And because everything sounded correct, I never questioned it. Nothing dramatic happened in my life. There was no collapse. No single moment where everything fell apart. No loss big enough to point at and say, that's when it started. If anything, my life was smooth. That's what made it so convincing. That's what made it so hard to notice what was missing. I wasn't failing. I was functioning. That distinction matters more than people think. Failing gets attention. Failing forces change. When you fail, something is clearly wrong. But functioning is quieter. Functioning lets you keep going even when something is off. It lets you ignore questions that don't have urgent consequences. It rewards you for staying busy. It praises you for endurance. And slowly, without realizing it, you start mistaking motion for direction. Every day felt productive. Even on days when nothing meaningful happened, I could point to tasks completed, messages sent, time spent. I could say I was moving forward. And in a technical sense, I was. But movement doesn't always mean progress. Sometimes it just means you're avoiding stillness. There was a feeling I couldn't explain. Not sadness, not anxiety, not fear. It didn't have a name I recognized. It was more like a low-level pressure, always present, never loud enough to demand attention. Like background noise you stop noticing because it's always there. I didn't talk about it. How do you explain a problem when everything looks fine? How do you complain without sounding ungrateful? So I didn't. Instead, I stayed busy. Busy was safe. Busy gave me excuses. Busy kept questions away. As long as I had something to do, I didn't have to think about why I was doing it. I told myself I'd slow down later. I told myself clarity would come eventually. I believed that if I kept making sensible choices, meaning would catch up. That's what people tell you after all. Make good decisions. Stay consistent. Don't overthink it. So I didn't overthink it. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But ignoring questions doesn't make them disappear. It just pushes them into the background, where they quietly shape everything else. Over time, the pressure changed. It wasn't sharp. It was heavy. I started feeling tired in ways that rest didn't fix. Not physically, mentally. I could sleep and still wake up exhausted. I could take breaks and still feel drained. There was no clear reason, which made it easy to dismiss. I told myself it was normal. Everyone's tired. Everyone feels this way sometimes. That's what adulthood is, right? You push through, and you adapt. You learn to live with it. That explanation worked for a while, until it didn't. I began to notice how often I was rushing, even when there was no reason to. How uncomfortable silence made me. How quickly I reached for distractions the moment things slowed down. It wasn't panic. It was avoidance. A quiet urgency to keep moving, to stay occupied, to not sit with my own thoughts for too long. Because when I did slow down, something surfaced. Not a clear thought. More like a realization I didn't want to fully look at. A sense that I was doing everything right. But for reasons I no longer understood, that my life had become a series of reactions instead of choices. That I was following momentum more than intention. I didn't feel trapped. I felt disconnected. There's a difference. Feeling trapped implies resistance. You know what you want, and something is stopping you. This wasn't that. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. And that scared me more than any obstacle could have. It's hard to fight when you don't know what direction you're facing. At some point, I realized I was spending most of my energy maintaining an image of stability. Not for other people. For myself. I needed to believe I was fine. Because if I wasn't, then what? Then all the choices I'd made would need to be examined. All the assumptions would need to be questioned. And I wasn't ready for that. So I kept functioning. I told myself that meaning was overrated. That fulfillment was a luxury. That discipline mattered more than desire. Those ideas sounded mature, responsible. They were easy to defend. But beneath them was a quieter truth I didn't want to admit. I wasn't choosing discipline over desire. I was choosing familiarity over uncertainty. I was choosing what felt safe over what felt honest. There's a point where avoidance stops feeling like avoidance and starts feeling like identity. You forget that you're avoiding anything at all. You just think this is who you are. Practical, rational, grounded. You wear those traits like armor. And armor works. It protects you, but it also makes it harder to feel anything fully. I didn't notice when my life became something I was managing instead of living. It happened gradually, in small compromises, in decisions that made sense at the time, each one reasonable, each one justified. Until one day, I realized I was exhausted not because I was doing too much, but because I didn't know what any of it was for. That realization didn't come with drama. There was no breakdown, no tears, no sudden clarity, just a quiet moment where the noise dropped enough for me to hear myself think. And what I heard wasn't comforting. It was honest. I wasn't chasing success. I was running from discomfort, from doubt, from the possibility that I had built a life that worked but didn't belong to me. As long as I stayed in motion, I didn't have to face that possibility. As long as I kept functioning, I could avoid asking questions I didn't know how to answer. That's the part no one talks about. Functioning can be a form of hiding. Productivity can be a shield. Routine can be a way of not looking too closely at your own life. And the longer you rely on those things, the harder it becomes to stop. Because stopping feels irresponsible. It feels like giving up. It feels dangerous, especially when nothing is technically wrong. There was no breaking point, no moment where I decided everything needed to change. Just an awareness that something had already changed. Quietly, over time. I noticed how often I felt detached from my own decisions, how little excitement or resistance I felt toward the future, how neutral everything had become. Neutral can be deceptive. It feels stable, balanced, but it can also mean numb. It can mean you've learned how to keep going without being fully present. And once you realize that, it's hard to unsee. I didn't stop because I was lost. I stopped because I finally noticed that I was. Not lost in the sense of directionless chaos, but lost in familiarity, lost in routines I never questioned, lost in a version of myself that made sense on paper but felt distant in reality. That was the first honest pause I'd taken in a long time. Not to quit, not to escape, just to look. To admit that functioning wasn't enough anymore. That something deeper had been asking for attention. Quietly, patiently, waiting for me to slow down. I didn't have answers. I still don't. But for the first time, I understood the problem clearly. I wasn't broken. I wasn't failing. I was disconnected. And that realization mattered more than any solution. Because once you see that, you can't go back to pretending everything is fine. You can keep functioning. You can keep moving. But now there's awareness. And awareness changes things, whether you want it to or not. This isn't a story about fixing your life. It's not about dramatic change or sudden purpose. It's about noticing the difference between living and functioning. About recognizing when stability becomes avoidance. About understanding that just because something works doesn't mean it's right for you. This was the moment before everything changed. Not because something happened, but because something finally stopped being ignored. And once that happens, there's no unseeing it. This was the beginning.